Lost and found. The expanse of space stretched in every direction, a vast and lonely silence that Captain Eric Stanton was all too familiar with. His spacecraft, the Intrepid, floated quietly, having just endured a turbulent journey through an unknown wormhole. Eric checked his navigation system, only to see it blinking erratically, indicating an error. He muttered a quiet curse and tried to recalibrate. Nothing. They were off course, way off, with no immediate signal of their original location. Eric leaned back in his seat, assessing the situation. He could wait for the navigation system to reboot, but that could take hours, maybe even days. Suddenly, the ship jolted, a shudder that rattled the cockpit and threw him forward. Just as he steadied himself, the system displayed a message. Atmosphere detected. Prepare for descent. They were about to make an unplanned landing. The Intrepid descended quickly, piercing through a thick layer of grey clouds. Eric braced himself as the ship made a rough landing on an unfamiliar planet, its shock absorbers groaning under the impact. As the vibrations ceased, he took a deep breath, relieved to be in one piece. Outside, through the viewport, lay an endless landscape of strange, luminescent flora. The faint light from an unusual sky cast an eerie glow on everything, transforming the alien landscape into an ethereal sight. He activated his scanner and frowned when the screen showed no life forms detected. Confused, he scanned the landscape again, noting the dense mist swirling around like a living entity. It was strange and unnerving, but his training had taught him to trust his equipment. Until now. He geared up and stepped outside, hoping to get a better look at his surroundings. The air was cool and carried a metallic tang, mixing with the faint scent of something floral. Eric took a few steps forward, careful to keep his footing on the unfamiliar terrain. Suddenly, movement in the mist caught his attention. His eyes narrowed, and he reached for his communicator, intending to report his discovery, but stopped as a figure emerged from the haze. She moved with a fluid grace that defied any human motion he had ever seen. Her skin was a deep shade of green, shimmering under the sky's strange light, and her hair, a striking shade of violet, cascaded down her back. She was tall, with a presence that commanded the mist around her to part as she approached. Eric's scanner had registered no life forms, and yet here she was, a living enigma. "You look lost." Her voice was soft, but there was an undeniable sharpness in her tone. Eric met her gaze, noticing her piercing golden eyes observing him with an unreadable expression. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. "Just a little off course," he replied, doing his best to maintain a calm demeanor. "Didn't mean to intrude, just trying to get my bearings." The alien woman tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as she examined him from head to toe. "You're human," she stated, her voice filled with both curiosity and a faint edge of amusement. Eric nodded, feeling the tension in the air between them. "I am. And you are?" "I'm called Lyra," she said, her gaze unblinking. "And this is my territory." Her words hung in the air like a silent warning, but Eric sensed a flicker of something else, an intrigue, perhaps even fascination. Before he could respond, Lyra's hand moved with inhuman speed, and a soft hum vibrated through the air as a strange device in her palm emitted a wave that rendered him instantly immobile. He felt a strange warmth on his skin and a gentle numbness settling into his limbs. The last thing he saw was her enigmatic smile before everything went dark. Awakening in shadows. Eric's consciousness returned slowly, his senses clouded by a lingering fog. His head throbbed as he struggled to open his eyes, the light around him dim and muted. He attempted to move, only to find his wrists and ankles bound tightly in some kind of glowing restraints. Panic sparked within him, but he took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. The room was vast and circular, the walls lined with a translucent material that pulsed faintly with a soft blue light, casting shadows across the strange alien architecture. The air was cool, but not unpleasant, tinged with the same metallic, floral scent he had noticed outside. Eric focused, straining to get his bearings, when the quiet sound of footsteps reached his ears. He looked up and saw Laura, the alien woman who had first approached him on the planet's surface, stepping into the room. This time, she was accompanied by two others of her kind, both bearing a similar green hue to their skin, but lacking the same intensity in their eyes. They were dressed in dark, close-fitting attire with strange symbols etched along the fabric, moving in sync like silent shadows. Laura dismissed them with a subtle wave of her hand, and they left as quietly as they'd arrived. She stood before him, studying him as if he were a rare and peculiar creature, her golden eyes gleaming with curiosity and perhaps a hint of something deeper. "Awake already," she murmured, her voice laced with amusement. She tilted her head, examining his restrained form. Humans do seem to have a remarkable resilience. Most would have taken much longer to recover. Eric's jaw clenched, but he met her gaze unflinchingly. "I'd say your hospitality leaves a bit to be desired. Care to explain what all this is about?" Laura raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his defiance. "Your arrival was unexpected, and we have strict protocols for dealing with unknown entities in our territory," she replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "But you, Eric Stanton, have piqued my interest. Humans are rare visitors here, and I've heard much about your kind." He tensed slightly, hearing his name spoken with such familiarity. "So you know who I am," he said, his voice low. "Then you must understand that holding me here won't end well for you." "Ah," she mused, circling him slowly. That famed human pride. Fascinating. Her gaze flickered over his face, sharp and appraising. "Tell me, what drives a human to venture so boldly into the unknown?" "Curiosity. A thirst for power." "Curiosity," he replied tersely, his gaze steady. "Humans have always been explorers. We reach out because we're driven by the unknown. We seek knowledge." Lyra stopped, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his face. "Knowledge, yes." Her tone grew softer, almost contemplative. "Your kind fascinates me because you willingly place yourselves in situations beyond your understanding, defying reason." She leaned in closer, her golden eyes studying him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "And yet, I cannot help but wonder, how far would you go for this knowledge?" Eric held her gaze, his heart pounding as her words lingered in the air between them. "As far as it takes," he replied, his voice unwavering. "Knowledge and understanding are worth any risk." Lyra straightened, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. She moved to a panel on the wall, her fingers gliding over it with practiced ease. The restraints around Eric's wrists and ankles unlocked with a soft click, and he felt a surge of relief as the pressure on his limbs disappeared. "You are free to move," she said, watching him with a guarded expression. "But know that you are not yet free to leave." Eric flexed his wrists, feeling the residual ache from the restraints, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was his chance to gain some insight into her motives and perhaps the nature of this strange place. "Why give me the freedom to move if I'm still your prisoner?" "Because, Eric Stanton, I want to understand you," she replied, a faint challenge in her tone. "You are a guest here, as well as a curiosity. I want to see how you respond when given a semblance of freedom." He took a cautious step forward, assessing the room's exits and any possible routes of escape. But his curiosity was piqued as well, and he couldn't help but wonder what she intended to learn from him. "So, what is it you want to know?" he asked, meeting her gaze directly. "Your strength, your limits," she replied without hesitation. "Humans are unique in the galaxy, a species that thrives on contradiction. You are at once fragile and fierce, capable of destruction but also creation. I want to understand what makes you resilient." Eric held her gaze, feeling a strange intensity in her words. "And what makes you think I'll just give you that information willingly?" Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because, human, I believe your curiosity will drive you to understand me as well." They stood in silence, the charged atmosphere between them thickening with unspoken tension. Eric felt an unsettling mix of apprehension and fascination, as if they were two sides of the same coin, each seeking to unravel the mystery of the other. She gestured for him to follow, and he moved cautiously, every instinct alert. Lara led him down a series of corridors lined with the same glowing walls, each turn adding to the surreal, labyrinthine feel of this place. Finally, they entered a vast chamber filled with transparent orbs, each one displaying a holographic projection of planets, stars, and cosmic phenomena. Eric's gaze roamed over them, mesmerized by the vastness of the universe laid out before him. "This is our way of cataloging the stars," Lara explained, her voice soft. "Every world we encounter, every life form is recorded here. We preserve knowledge, much like your kind." Eric nodded, captivated by the delicate artistry of each display. "It's beautiful," he murmured, momentarily forgetting his situation as he admired the ethereal glow of distant galaxies suspended in mid-air. "Beauty is not often a term we associate with knowledge," Laura said, a hint of curiosity in her tone. "For us, it is utility, function. Beauty is unnecessary." "Maybe to you," Eric replied, still gazing at the stars. "But beauty can be a powerful reason for exploration. It inspires us, drives us to create, to preserve." He turned to her, meeting her golden eyes. "Maybe that's one of the things that makes us human." She studied him in silence, a contemplative expression flickering across her face. "Perhaps there is more to your kind than I first assumed." They stood in the vast chamber, two strangers bound by curiosity, and Eric felt a strange kinship, as if they were both explorers of the same uncharted territory, each other. And as he held her gaze, he felt the question burning in his mind. How far would they both go to uncover the secrets that lay between them? The game of secrets. Eric's senses remained heightened as he followed Lyra through the endless corridors of her world, a vast alien construct that seemed as much a part of the natural landscape as it was a structure built with precision and intent. The place pulsed with a faint energy, as though the very walls held secrets, and Eric found himself marveling at the sheer magnitude of it all. He had trained himself to stay calm in unknown environments, but the enigma of this place gnawed at him, each shadow and pulse a reminder of how little he understood. Eventually, they arrived at a smaller, more intimate chamber bathed in deep green light. A table stood at the center, illuminated by a faint, glowing orb that floated just above it, casting strange patterns across the walls. Laura gestured for him to sit, and Eric reluctantly complied, his gaze darting around the room for any potential exits. Lara took her place opposite him, her posture poised and unreadable, yet her eyes carried a subtle glint of intrigue, the same spark he had noticed in their earlier encounters. "You have a choice, Eric," she began, her tone calm yet charged with an undercurrent of challenge. "We can approach this as captor and captive, or as two seekers of knowledge, unbound by convention." Eric raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. "And I'm supposed to believe this is just about knowledge?" Lara's mouth curved into a faint smile. "Knowledge can be a powerful bond, Eric. As much as power, and sometimes even more so than trust." There was something in her tone that gave Eric pause, a hint of vulnerability masked beneath her usual composure. He had seen similar expressions before, in people who guarded their motives carefully. But there was more here, a strange intensity that seemed to go beyond her desire to understand humans. He leaned forward, meeting her gaze head-on. "Then let's test that theory," he said, his voice even. "If you're so interested in human resilience, then maybe you should understand where it comes from. Our species has survived everything from planetary disasters to our own conflicts. We're survivors because we find purpose, even in the most hostile places." His tone hardened, a hint of defiance seeping through. "And right now, my purpose is to figure out why you're so interested in me." Lara's gaze lingered on him, as if she was studying a complex equation. "Purpose," she repeated, almost as if testing the word's weight. "Perhaps that's where we differ. My kind have long since evolved beyond the need for purpose in the way you describe it. We exist in harmony with our surroundings, seeking understanding for its own sake, unburdened by the quest for meaning. So, why me? He pressed, feeling the tension thickening in the air between them. If your people have evolved past the need for purpose, then why am I here? Why am I not just another catalogued entity in your star archives? Her eyes narrowed slightly, betraying a flicker of irritation and something deeper, an internal conflict she hadn't yet resolved. Because, Eric Stanton, you embody something unique, a balance of logic and emotion, survival and creativity. And unlike others, you did not cower in fear when confronted with the unknown. She leaned forward, her golden eyes locking onto his. You faced it with defiance. The intensity of her words struck a chord in Eric, and he found himself taken aback by the raw admiration in her tone. Despite himself, he felt a strange kinship building between them, as though they were both players in a game that transcended their individual motives. He looked around, the silence stretching between them, heavy and unyielding. So what now? He asked, his voice softer. You're curious about me, and I'll admit I'm curious about you. But curiosity alone won't get us anywhere. What's the real reason you've kept me here? A spark ignited in Lyra's eyes, and she rose from her seat, circling the table slowly. If you truly want to know, she said, her tone dropping to a whisper, then I'll show you. With a graceful gesture, she activated a panel embedded in the wall, and the orb at the center of the table brightened, revealing a three-dimensional projection of a distant galaxy. Stars glistened and spiraled, some dimming, others flaring with intense light. The image shifted, zooming in on a planet much like Earth, but with emerald oceans and crimson mountains. Eric leaned forward, mesmerized by the sight, feeling the weight of the cosmos pressing down on him. This is my world, Vindara, Lyra said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride. We have existed here for eons, in harmony with our planet and each other. But like all things, our stability comes at a cost. Our people are bound by a strict order, a balance that forbids deviation. She glanced at him, a subtle challenge in her gaze. A balance your presence disrupts. Eric processed her words carefully, feeling the complexity of her world pressing against his understanding. So, you're saying that even knowledge has limits here? He asked, intrigued by the paradox she presented. Lyra's lips tightened, and for the first time, he saw a hint of frustration in her eyes. Yes, knowledge, exploration, these are privileges, not rights in our society. Each action, each discovery, is carefully controlled to ensure it doesn't threaten the harmony we've built. And yet, her voice trailed off, her gaze distant as though she were peering into the vast expanse of her own thoughts. And yet, Eric prompted, sensing that he was on the verge of something significant. And yet, she continued, I find myself drawn to the unpredictability of your kind. Humans are willing to risk everything, to defy order, all in the name of discovery. Her eyes met his, an intense curiosity burning in their golden depths. Tell me, Eric, what is it about your species that drives you to act with such abandon? Eric considered her question, understanding now that she was as much a prisoner of her society's constraints as he was of his current circumstances. It's in our nature, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. We seek understanding, not just for survival, but because it gives us a sense of meaning, something that goes beyond existence. Maybe it's because we don't have the same harmony your people do. Our world has always been chaotic, unpredictable. Lyra's expression softened, and she sank back into her seat, seemingly lost in thought. Chaos, she whispered, as if the word were a strange and forbidden concept. And yet, it gives you purpose. Maybe that's why you find us so fascinating, he replied, a subtle smile playing on his lips. Because deep down, you're curious about what lies beyond the boundaries your society has set for you. A tense silence settled between them, each grappling with the implications of their conversation. Eric sensed that he had struck a chord within her, a glimmer of doubt that lay beneath her carefully constructed facade. It was as if she were balancing on the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't fully comprehend. Finally, she rose, her gaze lingering on him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Perhaps you're right, Eric Stanton," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Perhaps I do want to understand what lies beyond." She moved toward the door, her movements fluid yet purposeful. "But understand this. My people will not tolerate threats to our stability. Your presence here is as much a test of my own restraint as it is of your resilience." She left him alone in the chamber, the door sliding shut with a soft hiss. Eric sat in the silence, his mind racing with the revelations of their conversation. He was no longer merely a captive. He was a catalyst, an agent of change in a society that feared deviation. And though he remained uncertain of his fate, he couldn't help but feel that he had been given a glimpse into something extraordinary, a world bound by order, yet yearning, in some small part, for chaos. As the lights dimmed, Eric leaned back, a newfound determination settling within him. If there was one thing he knew about humanity, it was that they thrived in the face of adversity. And here, in the heart of an alien civilization bound by rules and restrictions, he would find a way to leave his mark. But as he sat in the quiet, the shadows shifting around him, he realized with a faint sense of wonder that perhaps he was no longer alone in his curiosity. Lyra, too, was on the brink of discovery, walking a path that might lead them both into uncharted territory. Forbidden territories. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time was a slippery thing in the quiet, pulsating chambers of Lyra's world. Eric had little to do but think, the strange alien architecture around him somehow amplifying his thoughts rather than distracting from them. His mind returned often to Lyra's words, the look in her golden eyes that hinted at a longing for something more, something that her society's rigid order couldn't fulfill. Beneath her cool exterior, there was an ember of rebellion, a curiosity restrained only by the expectations of her people. And now Eric suspected he was the key that could unlock it. The silence was broken by the soft sound of a door sliding open, and Eric looked up, half expecting another silent, brooding escort. But it was Lyra, alone, her face shrouded in a mixture of resolve and hesitation. She gestured for him to follow, and though his muscles were stiff from inactivity, Eric rose without question, feeling that something momentous was about to unfold. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing softly as Lyra led him down a series of corridors unlike any he'd seen before. The walls here were different, lined with shimmering tapestries of strange symbols that seemed to flow like liquid when viewed from certain angles. The air grew colder as they descended, and a faint hum permeated the atmosphere, vibrating at a frequency that set his nerves on edge. At last, they arrived at a chamber that was larger and darker than the others. The walls glowed faintly with swirling patterns, and at the center stood a monolithic structure, smooth and dark, exuding an almost tangible energy. Lyra approached it with a sense of reverence, her gaze fixed on the monolith as though it were an ancient relic. "This," she murmured, breaking the silence, "is the heart of Vindara." Eric watched her, noting the awe in her tone. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is our source of balance," she replied, placing a hand on the cool, dark surface. The monolith seemed to respond, its patterns shifting and pulsing under her touch. "It connects us, binds us to our purpose. Every decision, every thought, is guided by its influence. Without it, our society would collapse into chaos." Eric studied her face, seeing the conflict that lay beneath her carefully maintained composure. "But if it enforces control, doesn't it also prevent growth?" he asked. "If your people can't question, can't challenge, then how can you truly understand the universe?" Lyra's expression tightened, and for a moment he thought she might walk away. But instead, she turned to face him, her gaze fierce. "That is precisely why you are here, Eric," she said, her voice a mixture of frustration and fascination. "Your very presence disrupts the balance, introduces a variable that the heart cannot predict. It is an anomaly, and it terrifies them." "Terrifies who?" he asked, trying to grasp the full scope of what she was saying. "My people," she replied, her voice softening. Our leaders, the ones who have built and maintained this society for centuries, they fear the unknown, and your species, is the embodiment of it. They see humanity as a threat to the harmony we've created, and yet, her voice trailed off, and her gaze drifted to the heart once more. There is a part of me that wonders if they're wrong. Eric took a step closer, the charged atmosphere between them thickening. So what are you saying, Lyra? That you want to know if there's a way to break free from this balance? Her eyes met his, and in that moment he saw the depth of her struggle. Yes, she admitted, the word barely a whisper. But even questioning it could lead to exile or worse. My position here gives me certain privileges, but there are limits even I cannot defy. If we tamper with the heart, it could mean the end of everything I know. Eric took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. They were standing at the edge of something dangerous, and he understood now that this was not just a personal struggle for her, it was a test of her very identity. What if there's a way to learn without destroying, he suggested. What if you and I could explore this together? For a long moment, she regarded him in silence, her gaze searching his face as if weighing his words. Then, without a word, she placed her hand on the monolith and motioned for him to do the same. Hesitantly, Eric reached out, his fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface. Instantly, a surge of energy coursed through him, filling his mind with fragmented images, visions of distant stars, strange landscapes, and voices echoing in an ancient language. He gasped, pulling his hand back as the visions faded, leaving him disoriented. What was that? The heart, she explained, her voice steady. It connects us to everything, our history, our knowledge, our purpose. Only those deemed worthy are allowed to touch it. She paused, her gaze softening. You are the first outsider to do so. Eric steadied himself, processing what he had just experienced. The connection had been overwhelming, a flood of alien thoughts and emotions that made him feel both profoundly connected and isolated. If this heart holds all your knowledge, then what's to stop you from expanding beyond your planet? He asked, sensing that the monolith was more than just a symbol, it was a prison. Lyra's expression darkened. Because the heart restricts our minds, limits our thoughts to ensure obedience. It is why we are able to exist in harmony, and yet, it is also our greatest limitation. That is why our leaders forbid any contact with other species. They fear that exposure to new ideas would shatter the balance they have worked so hard to maintain. Eric felt a surge of anger and empathy, a realization of how deeply she and her people had been controlled. Then maybe the problem isn't humanity. Maybe the real danger is this. He gestured to the heart, this cage disguised as order. She didn't respond immediately, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, hope, or perhaps rebellion. If what you say is true, then releasing ourselves from it would mean a complete reformation of everything we know, she whispered, her voice trembling with the enormity of the thought. Our society would descend into chaos, and I could lose everything. Eric stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. But you could also gain something. Freedom, discovery, a chance to grow beyond what this heart dictates. Isn't that worth the risk? She held his gaze, the weight of his words hanging heavily between them. For a moment, he thought she might retreat, that the fear ingrained within her would overpower her curiosity. But then, with a sudden determination, she reached up and touched the heart once more, the symbols glowing brighter under her fingers. The leaders have always told us that to challenge the heart is to bring ruin upon ourselves, she said, her voice shaking but determined. But what if the ruin is simply a new beginning? Eric placed his hand beside hers, feeling the power of the heart pulse through him once more. Then let's find out, he said, his voice steady. Together. They stood in silence, bound by a shared defiance, their hands resting on the heart of Vindara as the energy around them intensified. The symbols on the monolith pulsed faster, their patterns shifting in response to the human touch, as though awakening from a long slumber. Eric felt a wave of resistance, a force that pushed against him, but he held firm, his determination unwavering. Suddenly, the energy surged, and the chamber filled with a blinding light. Voices echoed through the room, whispering in an ancient dialect that neither he nor Lyra could fully understand. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath them seemed to ripple as if alive. The light faded, and a hush fell over the room. Eric released his grip, breathing heavily, and looked at Lyra, who appeared equally shaken. The heart had gone still, its once dynamic symbols frozen in place, and an eerie silence filled the air. "What? What have we done?" she whispered, her voice laced with both fear and exhilaration. "We've opened a door," Eric replied, his voice filled with wonder. "And now, we decide what lies beyond." For the first time, he saw a genuine smile on her face, one that held the spark of rebellion and freedom. She reached out, taking his hand, her grip firm and steady. "Then let us step through it together, Eric Stanton," she said, her voice filled with a newfound courage. "No matter what lies ahead, we are no longer bound by the rules of the past." As they turned to leave the chamber, a low, ominous hum filled the air, a reminder that their actions had set something powerful into motion. They were stepping into the unknown, a path that held both liberation and danger, but Eric felt a surge of exhilaration. They were explorers now, united in purpose, forging a future that neither of their worlds could have predicted. And as they walked side by side through the corridors of Vindara, he knew that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The heart of Vindara had been awakened, and with it, a new era had begun. Breaking the chains. As they moved through the dim corridors, Eric felt the weight of their actions settle around him, a tension pulsing like a heartbeat in the very walls. The heart of Vindara had been their society's anchor, binding its people to a life of balance and control. By touching it, by challenging its influence, he and Lyra had created a ripple, and Eric sensed that this was only the beginning. The silence between them was thick with anticipation and a touch of apprehension. He glanced at Lyra, noting the determination etched into her expression, tempered with a glint of uncertainty. Her golden eyes held a fierce resolve, yet beneath that, he sensed a raw vulnerability, an awareness that they were stepping into forbidden territory with no map, no guarantee of survival. After what felt like hours of walking, they emerged into a vast, domed chamber. Unlike any space he'd seen so far, it was open, grand, with a ceiling that stretched high above, showing glimpses of the alien sky beyond. Lyra stopped, her gaze fixed on the other end of the chamber where a group of her people stood waiting. Their expressions were grave, unreadable, and their eyes locked onto her with a mix of scrutiny and distrust. "Lyra," one of them called, his voice deep and commanding. He was older, his skin a darker green, his stance both rigid and graceful. "You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The heart has spoken." Lyra straightened, her posture defiant. "The heart was silent for too long," she replied, her voice steady. "For centuries, we have lived in blind obedience, never questioning, never challenging. But today, we have seen what lies beyond that silence." The elder's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You have allowed an outsider to taint our most sacred bond. This human is an anomaly, a threat to our way of life." Eric held his ground, meeting the elder's gaze. "With all due respect, it's not your way of life I'm here to challenge. It's the fear of change that you've built around it. Your people deserve to see the universe for what it truly is, not through the veil of a single entity's control." The elder's gaze flickered with barely contained disdain, but it was Lyra who stepped forward, her voice calm but unyielding. "We cannot remain stagnant, bound by rules that prevent growth." Eric's arrival here was no mere coincidence. It was an opportunity to see beyond our boundaries, to understand that change is not always a threat, but a path to greater understanding. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd, some shifting uneasily, others exchanging glances of quiet curiosity. The elder's face remained impassive, his eyes boring into Lyra's as though trying to root out any lingering defiance. "You are young, Lyra," he said finally, his tone laden with condescension. "You do not understand the risks. Our society has thrived for millennia by adhering to balance and order. Disruption leads only to chaos." "But is it balance if it's forced?" Eric challenged, stepping up beside Lyra. "You've built your entire way of life on a foundation that requires obedience without question. But true balance, real harmony, comes from choice, from understanding both sides and finding a path that respects each individual's freedom." For a moment, the elder was silent, his eyes searching Eric's face as though trying to comprehend the depth of his words. Then, with a wave of his hand, he signaled to the guards standing nearby. They moved forward, their faces expressionless as they reached for Eric's arms. Lyra stepped in front of him, her stance protective, her gaze unwavering. "He is under my protection," she declared, her voice ringing with authority. "As a member of the council, I have the right to grant safe passage to anyone I deem valuable to our society." The elder's gaze darkened, his expression tightening. "You are a member of the council, but even your privileges have limits, Lyra. The heart has decreed our path, and your actions, your defiance, have forced us into a confrontation we did not choose." Lyra met his gaze, her voice laced with steely resolve. "Then let us choose a new path. Let us face the unknown instead of fearing it." Another murmur went through the crowd, louder this time, as her words hung in the air. Eric felt a spark of hope. Perhaps Lyra's courage, her defiance, was awakening something in her people, stirring the long-suppressed desire to explore, to question. He sensed the shift, a subtle change in the way the crowd regarded him, their curiosity mingling with something deeper, a hunger for freedom. The elder raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. "Enough," he declared, his voice resonating with authority. "This human's influence has already reached too far. He will be taken into custody until we decide his fate." Lyra's fists clenched, but before she could protest, Eric spoke, his tone firm. "If you imprison me, you'll only be proving my point. You say your society values balance, yet the moment someone questions it, you respond with control. That's not balance, that's fear." The elder's face remained impassive, but Eric noticed a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was a small crack, barely visible, but it was enough to encourage him. He turned to the crowd, his voice steady. "I come from a world where we faced countless challenges, both from within and beyond. We've struggled, fought, and sometimes failed. But in every struggle, we found a way forward, not by silencing those who question, but by learning from them. You have a chance here to evolve, to grow beyond the limits you've placed on yourselves." The silence stretched, the tension thickening as the crowd absorbed his words. Finally, a young woman stepped forward, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "I want to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to see what lies beyond our borders." Another joined her, an older man with a weathered face. "If our lives are bound by fear, then we are not truly living," he said, his tone somber but resolute. One by one, others stepped forward, their voices joining in a quiet chorus of agreement, their expressions ranging from curiosity to defiance. Eric felt a surge of exhilaration. This was more than a protest. It was the beginning of a transformation. The elder's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he realized the depth of the shift. "You are treading dangerous ground," he warned, his tone heavy with foreboding. "The heart's power is not something we can control or understand fully. If you choose this path, you risk the destruction of everything we have built." Lyra turned to face him, her gaze steady. "Sometimes destruction is necessary for growth," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "If our society is so fragile that a single act of questioning can bring it to ruin, then perhaps it is time to rebuild it from the ground up." The elder clenched his jaw, his expression one of barely contained rage. But before he could speak, a deep rumble reverberated through the chamber, the floor trembling beneath their feet. The heart of Vindara had awoken, its pulse resonating through the walls like a heartbeat, powerful and relentless. A hush fell over the crowd as the monolithic structure in the distance began to glow, its symbols shifting, their patterns flowing like liquid fire. The heart's energy filled the room, overwhelming and almost suffocating, as though it were aware of the challenge to its authority. Lyra stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the glowing heart, her voice steady but fierce. "This is our chance to choose a different path," she declared, her words cutting through the silence. "We are no longer bound by the fear of change. We are free to create a new world, one that embraces the unknown." The elder's face twisted with fury, but he was silenced by the sheer power of the heart's resonance, its energy flooding the chamber with a force that left everyone momentarily breathless. Eric felt its power washing over him, a wave of both challenge and invitation. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "This is more than just a choice, it's a new beginning. Together, we can shape a future that's built on understanding, on freedom, and on the courage to explore the unknown." As he spoke, he felt Lyra's hand slip into his, her grip steady and warm, a silent affirmation of their shared purpose. They stood side by side, facing the heart of Vindara as its symbols pulsed with renewed intensity, as if acknowledging their defiance. The crowd watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of awe and trepidation. The elder, his voice trembling with rage and desperation, raised his hands. "You are tampering with forces beyond your comprehension. This will only bring ruin." But Lyra's gaze remained unwavering, her voice calm and resolute. "No, elder, this will bring change, and for the first time in centuries, our people will know what it is to truly live." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and the elder's face darkened, realizing that his authority had crumbled, that his influence was slipping away like sand through his fingers. The heart's pulsing light intensified, filling the chamber with a brilliance that was almost blinding. And in that moment, Eric understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back. As the crowd surged forward, a collective force of newfound purpose, Eric and Lyra stood at the forefront, united by a shared vision, bound by a courage that transcended fear. They had broken the chains of tradition, shattered the boundaries that had held them captive, and as they gazed into the heart of the monolithic structure, they knew that a new era had begun. For better or worse, the people of Vindara were free.